Hello, and welcome to another DevNet training video. In this video I'd like to cover scripting inside the 6Web environment. You can see that I'm using 6Web 6.3 beta for this. Probably the best place to learn about scripting inside the 6Web environment is to go to the DevNet website. Underneath the library I can navigate to 6Web articles that contain this scripting in the web world article. So if I just go library, articles, 6Web, I'll find that scripted in the web world article listed there. In this article it covers various things from using the SOAP config utility in order to enable scripting, or you can go ahead and see how to modify the web config file directly. We're going to go ahead and do this in this video. It also goes through and defines how you declare the prototypes in any of the script files or assemblies that you're going to create. It also talks about the 3 different ways that you can run scripts. Go and read this article to learn more about the procedures for creating scripts. In this video I'd like to demonstrate how to take an existing script that works inside the Windows world and go ahead and port that over for the web world. In this example I'm going to also go back to the DevNet website. I'm going to click on the library link, and then I'm going to click on the Snippet Library. And for this demo I'm going to take a pretty simple one that says create 5 activities based on a project and status. So what I've done is I've copied and pasted this code inside a VBS file, and I have that here inside my Visual Studio environment. You can see if I hover over the tab, it actually is a shortcut to the file in my SOARC/scripts directory, and the file is called projectcreated.vbs. So the idea is that when a project is created, I'm going to check the project type and the project status, and if those meet these requirements, if the type is a campaign and the project status is a planlike, which is a project status I have defined in my current database, if those equal true, then essentially I'm going to come down here and I want to define some appointments. So what I do is I create 3 variables here, one for the appointment, one for the contact ID, and one for a table task, essentially to hold the ID for the task table. Then I'm going to dimension 4 arrays, one to hold my appointment descriptions, one to hold my appointment start dates, end dates, as well as task types. So I define those below. Setting the contact ID equal to 0 here. Enable the task table is 67. That's the task table number. Then I'm going to define 5 activity descriptions. See those just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to go ahead and set some start times, and those are essentially just going to be some days from today, so in 3 days, and 10 days, and 1 month, and 2 months, and then 6 months. I'm going to define some end times, which will be based on relative to the start times. Then I'm going to go ahead and define the task types. So I'll go ahead and set these task types. Then I'm going to go ahead and loop over those 4 or 5 task types, and then create these appointments, and essentially creating 5 appointments. Once all those appointments are created, I should see an SO message box telling me that all 5 activities were created successfully. So let's go ahead and try that in the Windows environment now. I'll switch over to SuperOffice. Click on Projects, so I'm in Projects, and I want to create a new project, and I'll call this Scripting Demo, and I've got my task type, or my project type, defined as DM Campaign, which is right, and the status is Plan Login. So that's good. Now as long as I click on OK, we should see 5 activities pop up here, and in fact they do, and then I get the message box that says all 5 activities created successfully. Now what we want to do is switch over to the web world and see how we can do that for 6Web. Now I'm in Visual Studio, and I've opened up the 6web website as a website in the environment. You can do this with either the Expander Edition or the standard version of 6web. That's fine. I've opened up, down at the bottom I've gone and I've opened up the web config file, and you can see now inside the config sections we've defined a scripting section. If I go down to the scripting section, we'll see we have 4 keys, essentially a toggle in order to enable or disable scripting. We can set that to true or false. We can also define the script path, and this is kind of important because the script path I'm going to define here as a folder on my C drive called 6web scripts. If there was no scripts path defined, and this was set to enable set to true, then the default script path would go to the SOARC/scripts file, just like it does today. But the most important thing here is that if I come and I look at that folder, I need to enable the permissions on that folder. So I'll go into the properties and I'll look at the security, and especially when we're dealing in the web world, because ASP.NET work process has to be able to read and write files, or not write files, I'm sorry, read-only files from this folder. So I'm going to go ahead and enable access for the network service as well as for the ASP.NET machine account. So that's done. So now we know that 6web, or IIS, has access to that folder and will be able to read my scripts. We also have two more here, two more elements, or 2 more keys, one for timeout limit and also one for max timeouts. Timeout limit essentially says if your script doesn't finish executing within this amount of time, then abort it, and this is in milliseconds. Max timeouts say, okay, let's go ahead and the number of times that this script is allowed to time out before we remove it from the available scripts that are to execute. Okay. With that done, we've enabled scripting, we define a folder, and have some timeout limit max timeouts set. So now what we want to do is to port this project created VBS file that we have working inside the Windows world. We want to port that to the web world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my changes for the web config. I'm going to go to the top here into the solution, and I'm going to add a new project. For this example, since it's a VB script file and we have lots of VB scripts that are out there, we'll stick with the VB project. I'll just call this a class library. I'll call this scripts, actually web scripting. Yeah, web scripts. I'll go ahead and let that be created inside the web client updatable folder. That's fine. Now, I like the IntelliSense that I get inside Visual Studio. So for this example, I'm going to create an assembly that we deploy to that folder, and then have 6web read that assembly and execute the scripts that it contains. In order to do that, I need to have this public class that has a public shared main method, and then I declare the method prototype of the event I want to implement. So the first thing I'm going to do here inside my web scripts project is make a reference to the net server assemblies inside my website bin folder. So I'm going to do that. I know that that's over here, so I'll drill down into this. I'll go into my website's bin directory. I'll make a reference to well, all I really need, I guess, is services, since all I'm going to be doing is working with services. So we'll go ahead and we'll drill down to services, but I'm also going to drag in SO Core, SO Database, just in case there's any types in there, like in SO Core they might be enumerations or something I might need. But let's go ahead and just keep it simple. So I'm going to change the name of this class file to be, let's say, project created. Okay, the name of the class really doesn't matter. At the top of the file here, because I do want IntelliSense, I'm going to do a couple imports here. I'll do SuperOffice, and I'm also going to do SuperOffice.services, CRM services. Great. Now we talked about, because this is an assembly class, I need to have that public shared main method. So let's go ahead and do that now. And in here we don't actually have to do anything, just because of the way that the scripting inside 6web works. This will need to be here. Now it should be noted that this is not required when you declare simply a event method prototype in a VB file and just copy the VB file to the scripts folder. This is only the case where we have an assembly or a full class file. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to come over to the project created VBS file that we had, and I'm going to copy the entire contents over inside into our new public class project created. So just go ahead and paste that in, and you'll see that, well, for the most part it's going to work. Alright, so VB is, if I hover over here, you can see the IntelliSense is going to instantiate this. Anything that doesn't have a data type is going to be instantiated as an object. Now I don't necessarily want that in this case because I like strongly typed things. So I know that this is a string. I know that this is a string. Basically, the idea here is to get you thinking that most of the changes that are going to be required from upgrading from a Windows script to a web script is that now you're going to have to be adding in data types to these script files. Before we go any further though, let's go ahead and correct the method signature, or the prototype. And that is, here inside the Windows world, the event that we want to implement is on current project created. But it's not going to be that same name inside the 6web world. If we go back and we look at the way signatures are created, we have to understand what the web service calls are that 6web is making through the Web Services API in order to come up with the actual method signature. So we're going to be working with an after event and after save event specifically. So you can see here after save contact entity. You can imagine in our case it's going to be after save project entity, and it's going to have also the same signature because a save contact entity method has as its only parameter a contact entity, and so that's going to essentially make up the entities that we see in our prototype as well. So what we can do is we'll say I can copy this essentially because I only need to change a couple names, and I'll come back to the VB file, and this is going to be recalled to after save project entity. So after save project entity, and then the method signature is going to be project entities and not contact entities. So project entity. Oh yes, working in VB here. Right, we can do that here as well. And then state as an object. Now, if we had a method before save project entity, we would have also been passed in a project ID and a state object. If we look back at the website, see before save contact entity, it would have been a project entity and then this object state. And that's kind of important because I can manipulate that in the before event and pass that value into the after event and leverage that in any way I want here. So you can imagine I can keep track of before properties and check them in the after event to see if they have been changed or altered, and then what those values are if they have in fact been changed or altered, and then act accordingly based on that. So there are tons of possibilities there. In addition to just the prototype there, it is in fact going to be a sub, but we want to make sure that it is also public and shared or static inside the C# world. So, okay, public shared sub after save project entity takes in a project entity that essentially these are going to mirror each other, but we can modify one of them, and those changes will take effect outside when that object is returned to the 6-web environment. So I'm going to continue down here. Project status and type is going to stay the same, but the way that these are used, I no longer have access to currents, right? I can use the services API in order to get access to these values. I also have, because I'm inside 6-web, I have full access to my SO context object as well, which gives me full access to my identity, my company, my person, my roles, etc. So now these projects are being passed in up here. So let's go ahead and just make these a little bit more useful. So I'll say project, and I'll call the returned entity project just returned, just to differentiate those two. And I'll come down here and I'll start working with this if statement. So I'll say if the let's say put that here, if project dot project ID equals 0, and the project dot project type, great. Now what we want to do is go ahead and make sure that we have our arrays defined accordingly. We don't necessarily need any of these three variables anymore because, as you'll see below, I'll just use some enumerations and things of that nature. So appointment description, I can leave that essentially the same, but I'll just make sure I add this on and say it's a string, and I'll just call this integer. Okay. Now we want to go ahead and define the appointment descriptions. So I'll go ahead and I'll delete these, irrelevant. Don't need this anymore. Great. So this can stay the same, appointment description 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll come down and define our dates. Those are exactly the same. And then we get differences down here when we actually get to our task types. So our task types, we'll kind of have to know, we can set these just directly. We can say, okay, it's going to be 5, it's going to be 6, 7. No longer need to get those task items. Great. Now, because we're not in the scripting world, we don't have access to the database type in order to create an appointment. We're going to leverage the services API, since this is where all of the scripting events happen anyway. So if you have not read that article and you're just kind of following along with this video, just be aware that all of the scripting events inside SixWeb are not actually inside the web environment. They're happening on the application server where NetServer resides, because whenever SixWeb calls through the Web Services API, it's in the Web Services where the events are actually being fired, and also where the events here that we're now implementing are being called from. So I have full access to the Services API, and because I like IntelliSense, that's why I included a reference to that namespace up at the top. Okay. So the first thing I need to do is get access to something that's going to replace the database, and for that I'm going to use an appointment agent. So I'll say dim agent as appointment agent, and I'll equal that to, I'll use the agent factory, and I'll get the appointment agent. Great. And with that, I'm going to externally declare an appointment entity to work with, because we're going to create this over and over and over. We don't actually want to create this in our loop. We'll keep this outside. This is going to be an appointment entity. Great. And then we'll just go ahead and replace this code. Actually, we can just go ahead and keep some of that. Say appointment here. That's going to say agent dot create. Just say okay. Give me a default appointment entity. Now with that, I no longer have to call set defaults because, well, it's already doing that for me on the services side. So I'll say appointment dot type. We'll say equal to. Now we have enumerations that we can work with, which is great. And I'll give this one a appointment type in diary. Let's go ahead and get rid of that semicolon. And then for the appointment contact, these are, if we look at this, it's of data type SuperOffice.crm.services.contact data type. And so this is just essentially a very bare bones basic data type. Essentially what we want to do is just, we're going to create what's called a thin carrier. So we're going to instantiate a new instance of this contact, and then all we have to do at this point is set the contact ID. So we can then say appointment.contact.contact ID equals to, and here I'm going to use SO context, which is why I included SO core, and I'll say current principal dot contact ID because it's the current user. Okay, and for the description, we can just go ahead and assign this directly. I'll say, right, we'll set the start date, not the due date. In services there is no due date, it's just called start date. And then we'll use the due by dates for that, and then the same for the end date, so that will stay the same. For the project, we'll go ahead, it's a thin carrier as well, so we'll have to create a new project. And then, just like we did with contact, we'll just set the project ID. And we'll go ahead and set that to the return type, project return dot project ID. This is, you can think that now, don't need that semicolon, now this data type here coming in, the after save project entity event has fired, it now, this project that's coming in, now it has a project ID assigned to it. So we're going to want to leverage that and go ahead and assign that to these appointments. So now for the task type, it's actually going to be a task list item. So just like with the contact and project, we'll go ahead and say create a a new one of those. New task list item. Great. We'll say appointment dot task ID dot task list item ID equals that task list type. Okay, that should resolve. No longer is there an appointment save event. We'll actually use the agent in order to save this for us. So we'll say agent dot save appointment entity, and then we'll pass it in the appointment, and that should be it. We can no longer actually send messages back up to the application to 6Web, at least not in version 6.3. So we want to go ahead and just test this out and see if this will work. So in order for me to do that, instead of building it here, let's make sure it does in fact build. Character's not valid. Oh, my C# is getting the best of me. We'll go ahead and build that, so that builds successfully. Instead of copying this manually, I'm just going to go ahead into the project's properties, and in the compile tab, I'm going to click on the build events, and then in a post build event, I want to go ahead and copy this assembly, or the target path, which is the DLL, into my scripts folder. It would be nice if that was called the right thing. Target path, great. Save that, build that, and in fact it was copied over. So now if we go into the folder, we'll see that my web scripts file is there. So now the true test becomes if this is in fact going to work inside 6Web. So because I have made changes to the files that are found inside the scripts folder, I'm going to go ahead and do an Iis Reset just to make sure that the 6Web instance will go ahead and pick those changes up. Now I'll log in. And I'll come to the Projects tab. See, I was working with some scripts earlier. And then let's go ahead and create a new one. We'll call this one Scripting Demo 2. The status and type is as we expect. I'll just go ahead and click on OK, and then we should see some activities show up here. Right, so that was successful. We went off, we executed the save event for the project. After the project was saved, our event handler was called, and we created our 5 activities, just like in the Windows world. I hope that everything that you saw here in this video shows you just how easy it's going to be in order to upgrade the scripts from the Windows world into the 6Web scripting environment. Of course, scripts have various degrees of complexity, and that's what we have the forums for. So again, since we are going to be porting our scripts from Windows to web, and we're no longer going to have access to the application object and the currents that it exposes, or the database object that allows us to create various entities or models within the database, we now have to switch over and start focusing on leveraging the Services API in order to do those things. So I look forward to questions and comments about this functionality on the forums, and happy coding!